Hello everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist and welcome to my channel. Those of you who are brand new, welcome. Those of you who are returning, welcome back. Always good to see you again. For those of you who are new, my name is Kat Bowser. I am a licensed therapist, but I am also an author working on my first novel. And on my channel, I like to talk about what I consider to be the heart of writing, which are the characters. And the heart of the characters are in their psychology. So that's the angle I take with everything that I talk about, be it world building, character building, and everything that falls in between or outside of that range. So for today, we're going to dig right into a series I've been doing for a while, which is where I take character or plot tropes and we kind of dig into the psychology behind it, whether they're realistic or not, and just have a little bit of fun with it, honestly. So, given that we are now in the month of October, I thought it would be appropriate to dedicate this month strictly to the villains or evil tropes or things that fall into that rather dark category of literature. So, that being said, let's start off with one of the more popular of the tropes, and that is the sympathetic villain. So those of you who have been on my channel for a while, you know that my favorite type of villain is the irredeemable villain, but the sympathetic villain has a lot of room for fun too, and it has become much more popular in recent years. And to be honest, there's a good reason for it. As a general rule, a sympathetic villain is going to have a much more well developed backstory. They're going to have a lot more meat to their personality, and that overall creates a better character. So I totally get why this is a thing. That being said, I tend to divide the sympathetic villain into what I consider to be three separate categories. Number one, the sympathetic villain is sympathetic because of their past. Number two, they are sympathetic because of their cause. Number three, they're a mix of the two. And I realize that number three might be cheating a little bit, but I really think it is a separate category. So that's what we're going to go with. So first and foremost, the villain who is sympathetic because of their past. This one, to be frank, is not my favorite, although it can be done very, very well. I've done it in some measure in some of my own work. The main reason that I'm not a fan of it is because I think it perpetuates this myth that if you go through trauma, you're destined to grow up and be a horrible person, and that's not true. That's not true in the slightest. But there is definitely something to your childhood and your past having an impact on your present. That is 100% true. So let's look at that. So a sympathetic villain, the main key point of it is that we are supposed to feel empathy for them. And giving them a tragic backstory is a really easy way to do that. Most of the time with these characters, you're seeing a backstory that is either so horrific that you almost can't help but feel empathy for them, or there's usually an element, a theme that kind of runs through it. And in that case, I think it usually centers on them not having a place to belong or not being accepted by their family, their friends, that kind of thing. And really, I think what you can boil that down to is bonding. Those of you who have been on my channel a while know I've kind of touched on this briefly. There is a theory on attachment theory, which is basically the idea that when we're born, we form bonds with our caregivers. And we form those bonds by essentially learning that if we're in need of something, be it emotional, physical, or otherwise, these caregivers are going to respond and they're going to give us what we need. If that happens consistently, you get what we call a secure attachment. If it doesn't happen consistently, then you get a mix of other attachments. Trying to think, the one that probably pops up in villains the most. Oh goodness. Honestly, you could use any of the other attachments and they would probably fit, but the one that comes up to me the most is basically what I would call the inconsistent attachment, which is where sometimes they are responded to, sometimes they are not. And when that happens, your brain kind of isn't real sure what to make of it because, on the one hand, when they are attended to, it's something they need, it's something they want, but they're also learning that this isn't always going to happen, and there's no way for me to predict when it is going to happen. So, in a way, the brain kind of puts up a wall, an emotional wall, so to speak, so that you don't expect something that you may not get. And when that happens, people have a hard time learning to trust and bond and connect with other people. And that's something that can definitely be seen in a villain. A lot of times, um, we're going on just the backstory portion here. These villains can tend to almost be distant from society. They don't really have a concern with other people. They're not viewing other people either as important, or they're not viewing other people as something that they should be concerned with. They're more concerned with the well being of themselves. And given that kind of background, you really can't blame them. People that have insecure attachment, they can develop and learn how to bond with people, but it is very hard because your first attachment is what you base all your other ones on, because that's what you learned from. That's what you first realized as being attachment. So it takes a lot of work, and it takes someone who's willing to work with someone through a very hard learning process, and honestly, a process that is very hard on the person that they're attempting to bond with, because they're going to get a lot of emotional baggage, and it's not fun. Um, and while the results when someone sticks to it are wonderful, it's hard to find someone necessarily that will stick to it. And especially if you're writing a villain, you're not generally going to give them something that goes their way when if you're going with the tragic backstory element. Um, that aside, there's also the element of a character who has gone through a lot of trauma in their past. Like either they were abused, they were attacked, they lost their whole family, lots of different things. Now, each person goes through trauma a little bit differently, and it does depend on how old you are when it happens. So, in this case, let's say that they've been through some sort of abuse. And again, this is kind of why I don't like this trope, because just because you've been abused doesn't mean you're going to grow up to be this horrible dictator. In fact, most of the time people don't. However, taking that, let's roll with that a second. So let's say they went through some form of, so let's say sexual abuse, because that's the easiest one for people to picture right now. Usually we see one of two things happen. The person either completely turns against any form of sexual interaction, or they do the opposite, and that's all they go for. Now, are there people that fall in between? Yes, of course there are. I'm talking about extremes here, because we're talking about a villain, and usually villains run with the extreme. So, if you have someone who has grown up knowing nothing but violence, hurt, that's what they know how to do. And most of the time, that's what they've been told is how things are. A lot of times, you'll get people that have gone through this, and they have this idea of, okay, in order to not get hurt, I have to make myself physically stronger than the other people around me. I have to show them that they can't push me around. And that's a defense mechanism. So, again, it's understandable, but it doesn't generally lead way for very effective relationships. And I think that's really where this kind of villain suffers, is most of the time they don't have connections with anybody. They haven't really formed bonds. They haven't really connected with anyone that can give them positive emotional interaction. And when that happens, you have a very hard time empathizing with other people, because it kind of takes the role of, well, nobody cared about me, nobody empathized with me, so why should I care about anybody else? And again, I'm talking extremes here, but that seems to be the pathway that people take with this trope if they're using the tragic backstory. Now, second one is the villain's goals are understandable. They're doing a very trying to think of the word I'm trying to picture. Their goals are something the hero can sympathize and empathize with. They understand why this person is doing this goal. It's just the way they're doing it is the problem. So, in that case, let's say that your villain has the opinion that the government that the world is being run under is totally corrupt. It's not fair to any of the people, so they're going to get rid of said government and install their own form of government. Okay, people who have been oppressed under the old government are probably going to be on their side because they've grown up with this oppression. However, your villain goes about it by completely eradicating everybody that was remotely involved in the old government, regardless of if they really had a choice in what they were doing or not. And that is that extremism that usually will put them on the hero's radar. Like, okay, I get what you're doing, but you don't have to do it this way, kind of idea. And that can form from a lot of different things. It is possible that can form from trauma. It can also form just if this person has had a lot of failures in their life. Like, let's say they've tried to reform the government before. They have tried to do it essentially the correct way, more or less, and have not gotten anywhere with it. Usually if this happens, then something needs to trigger them to say, okay, you know what, screw it, I'm going to just go with the guns out, guns blazing method. And this is where you can kind of tie in if they do have loved ones, which I do like. I do like it when a villain has loved ones and people that they care about. If you have something happen with one of them or something that the villain holds very dear to their heart, that can be kind of their trigger point. Like, okay, I'm done. I'm done. I'm going to do this my way. I'm going to do this without any concern about the right way. I'm going to take what I want by force. And that's fun, because I think that leads way to some very interesting interactions with the villain. Because your hero generally is going to have this idea of, okay, the way you're doing this is wrong. There's no justification for what you're doing. But if the villain has a chance to counter that with, well, because of this, my mother died, or whatever that triggering point was. And then usually they follow that up with, what would you have done? And as much as the hero wants to say, well, I wouldn't have done what you did, they can't always say that. And those are the best kind of villains, the ones that are essentially mirror images of the hero. The hero sees themselves in this villain. And that makes not only their interactions more fun, it makes the hero's journey harder, because every time he has to fight against this obstacle, this person that he's going up against, he's essentially facing a fragment of himself. He sees himself in them and how he could be that way. Oh, that's so much fun. That is so much fun. Anytime you can introduce psychological or emotional drama, that's a great way to do it. So third bit is when you combine the two together. I've kind of talked about how those will work. Again, I'm not against the tragic backstory, but it needs to be done correctly. And that I think one thing that will help is if you have another character who has gone through a similar traumatic background and they don't turn out like the villain does. I think it's very important to show that not everybody follows this path. Because, again, you don't want to perpetuate this idea that because you've been abused, you're going to grow up and necessarily be an abuser yourself. Now, regarding that statistic, does it happen more often when people have been abused, becoming abusers themselves? Yes, it happens more often, but it's not like we're not talking like 95% or something. We're talking, I believe it's something like 20%. It's not that high. It's just statistically higher than people that haven't been abused. And honestly, the big thing that makes the difference is, does the person recognize that the abuse they went through was wrong? Do they recognize that what happened to them was not fair and was not just? If they do, most of the time, they are going to be set about breaking that cycle. So that's something to keep in mind too. And then of course there's the trope where the hero becomes the villain, but I think that's a video for a whole other day. I'm definitely going to do that one because that one's fun. But for today, I thought we'd just dive into this one a little bit. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. That was just a little brief intro into the sympathetic villain. I think this is a trope that actually has multiple tropes inside of it. So if you guys want to hear more about specific tropes that fall under sympathetic villain, let me know. I'll be glad to go into those. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you leave a comment. I always like to respond to them, or you can always follow me on social media. If you guys would like to know whenever I upload again, make sure you ring the bell and subscribe. I upload every Thursday and every Sunday. Occasionally you'll see a bonus video here or there. And until next time, I hope you guys have a good one.